I'm out here with my Solstice GXP. I've got a P0101 code. That's due to a crack in the intercooler. So I'm going to replace the intercooler with a Hahn intercooler. A little bit stronger intercooler that will hopefully resist cracking in the future. Now to start this project, I am going to remove the air intake, the air filter housing, and then I'm going to remove the turbo pipes. There's the one over there that goes into the intercooler, and here's the one that goes into the engine. Now you don't have to remove the air filter housing if you don't want to for this project. I'm going to do it to try to make it a little bit easier to get to the top of the intercooler to connect it and disconnect it. It's not too hard to do. I'm also going to replace a couple of the clamps with T-bolt clamps. Now to take this cover off, I've just got to undo all the perimeter clamps, undo the sensor connector, loosen the clamp, and then I've got to undo the PVC connection. And that part there can be fragile, so be careful with that. Now I've got to remove the air filter and the air filter housing. There's two bolts on each side. There's one right down here, one over on the far side. And then as we come around the car, you'll see that there's a bolt right down there that has to come out. So 3 bolts take that out. I'm going to take the top intercooler tube out. To do that, I've got that bolt that you see right there in the center of the frame. And then I've got to undo the clamp to the top tube. And then I've got to come around, and you probably can't see it in there, but I've got to undo a clamp off the coupler down there. Now to get to that, I'm going to go ahead and take this horn off, just so I have some room to get my hand down in there. I've got all the main parts of the intake system taken out. You'll see that I have put blue tape on items to remind me to hook them back up, and then I've got the ports plugged with rags just to keep anything out while I'm working. I took out screws just here in front of the fender, and then the fog lamp screw, I had to disconnect the light connector there as well. And then I took out the screws going across the fascia here, and I left the one in the middle just to help support the fascia while I'm working. And then I repeated the same removal of screws and electrical connectors over to the passenger side of the vehicle. Took off the screws that were under the wheel well. There was 4 of them, and at the very bottom there was one hidden behind this plastic. So a total of 4 screws came out there, and that allowed me to get up in between the wheel well and the side light here and disconnect the electrical connector to that light. Also, I've worked across the bottom, and I took out 4 plastic plugs that hold the fascia in to the bottom of the plastic in the car. I took the screws out of the other side, and after that I was able to gently pull the front fascia off, revealing the bumper system behind it. You'll see that the brake ducts stayed in place. So the first thing you want to check after you take the fascia off of your Solstice is you want to look at this bumper section right up in the front. Let me zoom in so you can see that a little bit better. And what you'll see there is GXP imprinted into that foam, and that just tells you that you made a good choice. So if you don't see that, you may not have made a good choice, but GXP, that's a good thing to see. Now let's take a look at the intercooler and see what the crack looks like. So you can see why that would put out a P0101 code. Nice big crack on there. So now I'm going to take this lower plastic panel off. There's 4 screws that I see so far. One is up in here that I already took out. It's going to be right back in here. And then you'll have one here mounted to the bracket that is right in front of the intercooler, and then you'll have the same two at the opposite ends. Alright, I've got the plastic off, and now all I've got to do is take off both of these brackets right in front of the intercooler. So it should be pretty simple, just a bolt up on top on that one, and a bolt up on top on the other side. I'm going to take the intercooler off. Looks like there's just going to be a couple screws at each end. So I'll just take those off on each side. And I believe it should just drop down from there. I've already got the tubes disconnected from the top section. So I believe that intercooler should just drop right down now. There you go, the intercooler just dropped right down like I thought it would. Real easy to get that out. I'm going to have to loosen both of these bolts to shift this intercooler bracket back. And I'm going to do that on both sides of the car. And then once that's done, I'm going to take these out and rotate them around and put them back in. So they just have to be reversed from how they were when they came out with the stock intercooler. Now that I've got this bracket loosened and about ready to push backwards, I'm going to move this subframe assembly aft as well. It won't move much, but we'll move it just a little bit. Now there's two bolts that we've got to remove. There's two 15mm bolts sitting at the top of that. And then we come underneath, and right in that area is a 15mm bolt that we have to remove. And then there's two more bolts that we have to remove back in here. Those are hard to get to, so let me come around to the top. Now you've got one bolt right at the top and then another one right below it. Now I was able to get to both of those bolts from the top side without having to remove this fender. It may not be that easy always, but give it a try. I temporarily mounted the Hahn intercooler just so I can get an idea of how much I'm going to have to cut on the shroud. Let's go ahead and look behind there and see what it looks like. So it's pretty hard to see here. You can see right there where it's touching the intercooler, so I'm going to have to trim that back and upwards. The center support, if I can get a picture of that, it's awful hard. Looks like that. So you can see how that one portion is sticking right into the middle of the intercooler. And so I'll trim that back as well. We'll do the same thing on the other side. It looks to me like it's only going to take about a ½ inch of cutting in the center section, and maybe a ¼ inch of cutting on the outer section. The other thing that I noticed that you'll want to be careful of is right here where that subframe assembly sits right next to the intercooler. So you can see it's a very tight gap right here. I've still got this bracket loose, and so as you move it fore and aft, that does close this gap here. So you just want to make sure when you assemble the intercooler, when you tighten it back in place, that this intercooler and this bar are not touching or rubbing, that you have some clearance there. Once you're ready to take the diverter shroud down, if you have the intercooler mounted in place temporarily, you'll need to take that off. But then you'll come up here and there's going to be 4 bolts that mount into the bumper. And those are the 4 bolts that hold that shroud in place. So pretty easy to get that out. I've got the diverter shroud off now, and it was just those 4 bolts across the top that brought it down. Now I'll go cut that shroud. I've got the diverter shroud off, and I've marked with tape where I'm going to cut. So on the outer parts of the shroud, I'm going to cut from the very lower corner right here, parallel up to the top end. So you can see that's about a ¼ inch that I'm going to cut off of the side piece. I'll do that on both sides, and then once that's done, I'll use a straight edge and measure across the span of the diverter to figure out how much material to take off of the center section. Now this is an estimate of what we'll be taking off. I at least know that that's about the right angle, going from right in the corner of the center bracket up to the corner of the top bracket. And that looks like that's going to be very close, but we'll find out once we get the cutting started. I finished the cutting of the diverter shroud, and I've got a level on here, and as I come across you'll see that there is virtually no gap there. So I've got the outer and the center ribs level at this time. So here's how it ended up looking on the side. And then here's the center section. And then we've got the last section right there. I'm going to go ahead and put the shroud back in. I'll just put it back in place, and 4 bolts across the top into the bumper will secure it. Before I tighten these bolts down, I'm going to push this diverter aft as far as I can towards the back of the car. I want to make sure that it is pushed as far back as I can, because those brackets are being pushed back and then the intercooler is being pushed back. So you need to make sure that the item right behind the intercooler is pushed all the way back. I went ahead and put the intercooler back in place just so I can see how things look. And so let's take a look at some of the clearances on it. So right up in there you can see some good clearance where I trimmed around the top of the shroud a little bit. The center post looks really good as well. And then the same can be said for the last corner. Now as we come around the bottom, it's awful hard to see, but there's good clearance between the intercooler and the shroud at all 3 points. So at no point is that shroud touching the intercooler. To adjust the bracket, I bent this tab so that I'd have more clearance near the intercooler right here. So bent this upwards, or this part that way a little bit. And then I'm going to put a little bow through the front of this bracket by compressing this in the vise. I've got a couple of socket extenders in here, and then as I tighten that down, it just puts a nice little bow in it to bring the mounting portion back to where it needs to be. I've got the intercooler mounted, and now I just want to show you the clearances on the intercooler as it's mounted. So there's a couple things that I did. The first thing is I want to look at these brackets. I did place a washer back behind that bracket so it has more surface area between the bracket and the frame. Just one washer that helped to push it out so I'd get a little bit more clearance. And you'll see that the clearance is pretty tight, but I did get it to have some clearance right between the top of the intercooler and the bracket. Now as we come down, I put a little bit of a curve in the bracket, and then it comes back in. And I've marked where it was supposed to sit on the intercooler. You can see the dot right here. So what I'm going to do is put 2 washers under here because this pulled up about 1 millimeter. So I'm going to put 2 washers on the bottom side and the bolt up on top when I mount that bottom plastic into place. Now as we come around to the side, I went ahead and put bigger washers on the outside of those rubber mounts, and I did the same thing on the inside. Without those, I noticed that the rubber mounts were ballooning or mushrooming around the intercooler mount. Make sure that you get a gap in between the intercooler and that subframe, and the way you do that is you push these mounts towards the passenger side of the car, and that will give you that gap that's needed. Perhaps there's a better view right there of the gap. And then the other thing I should point out is that I made sure that I rotated the bottom of the intercooler towards the aft of the car. That gave me 2 good things. It gave me a little bit more of a gap between the bracket and the intercooler at the bottom. The other thing it did is up on the top of the car, where the intercooler pipes come in, it gave me just a little bit more space to put the couplers onto the intercooler. You can see that I've mounted the couplers for the intercooler up on top, one on each side. I've got the bolt heads of the clamps facing towards the inside where I could access them easily with the air box out. There's another look at the passenger side. I've got the lower shroud on, and as you can see, I've got it spaced out with some washers. And then, so there's two brackets on the front that you install. And don't forget that there's a couple up underneath here as well. One on each side, so 4 in total right there. I reinstalled the air box onto the car, and there's 2 bolts that you've got to clamp down, one at each end of the air box, one there, and then there's one over on the other side that have to be clamped down. And then we've got one more right up on the front of the car, but it's right down in there. I just reinstalled the top tube, making sure to tighten that bolt right there in the center of the frame, tighten down the clamp to the rubber pipe. And then I tighten down the clamp down there. And I'm going to put the horn back on as well. Just goes right on the one stud right here that you see. Also, the tube has a bolt right here that you have to tighten down. Now that I've got the upper pipe in place, I'm going to go ahead and install the air filter cover and install that over to the pipe there. Now I've got the air filter cover in place. All the quick clamps around the perimeter are secured. I've got the sensor plug back in, and then the PVC plug. Also, I've got the clamp tightened down. Now I need to install the upper piping for the intercooler where it goes into the manifold. So that'll just connect down there and across the engine compartment back to the intake manifold. I've got the duct in and everything secured, the clamp underneath the intake manifold, the clamp down on the beginning of the pipe, the sensor, the vacuum hose, another bolt for the pipe, second bolt for the pipe, and then down lower the clamp into the intake manifold, into the intercooler. The brake ducts go in first before you put the front fascia on. Make sure that you have the right duct on the correct side. You have an L and an R for left and right, and make sure you have the text up on top. I've got the front fascia back on the car. Now, I learned a couple things. It is a little bit tricky. There's a lot of panels that crisscross in ways that you might not expect. One of the first things to pay attention to is right down in here. At each screw, this fascia actually has a tab behind it that goes in front of the screw plate right behind it. Now, it's not very obvious when you're putting it on that that's what happens, but you'll have to take it off, slide it over, push it in, and then do the other side. Otherwise, the top part was pretty straightforward. It just goes together with the screws. The easiest thing to do to line body parts back up is to line the washer up with the wear ring right behind it. Well, that looks like that's about it. All that remains for me now is to go test drive this. I'm looking forward to that part. Now, I do understand that it may take a little bit of time for the computer to get used to the different airflow through the intercooler. Also, I understand that due to the size of the larger intercooler, there may be a little bit of a turbo lag. I'm told it's not a whole lot, but something to be aware of. Anyhow, I hope you found this helpful, and I thank you for watching my video. Have fun with your Solstice.